Okay. Hi, everyone. I apologize for the technical difficulties and the delayed start. Um, I am currently in India and not in the US, which is the reason for the Wi-Fi issues. But I'm just going to kick it off with a short round of introductions, and then I'm going to pass it over to Sydney to uh, basically do the most walk us through most of the slides, and then we'll have about 20 minutes for Q&A. So I'll just start. I'm an assistant professor in the environmental studies program at UC Santa Barbara. I work broadly on energy transitions. Um, Sydney, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hey everyone, thanks for coming. I'm Sydney. This project actually started as my undergraduate thesis with Grace, so it's come a long way since then. But since then, I did some work in the energy sector in solar and hydropower, and now have started a separate AI company. But looking forward to talking about getting rid of coal.
I think I promoted Jeremy to panelist, but maybe that did not come through. Um, Jeremy, would you like to introduce yourself if that's possible for you to speak? No? Okay. There we go.
Thanks. Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Jeremy. Um, yeah, I helped out Sid on his bachelor's thesis and started working with Grace and Ranjit. I'm a PhD student in Germany, working on topological and geometric deep learning. It was really awesome to get involved in this program and this project and apply some of the math and methods that we develop for a good cause. So looking forward to the presentation.
Great. And the last co-author on this paper, who is unfortunately not on Zoom right now, is Ranjit Deshmukh, and he's a associate professor in the environmental studies program as well as the Bren School Environmental Science and Management at UC Santa Barbara. Um, and let's just get started with the slide deck, Signe, if you could share your screen.
Yeah. All right. Is everyone able to see my screen here?
Yes, I am at
Awesome.
least.
Okay. Yeah, let's jump into it. Wanted to talk about our paper on coal plant retirement in the US. So I think as most of you attending this webinar know, coal is in general just a bad source of energy. We in the US need to phase out all coal power in order to meet 2035 climate targets. And yet um, there's been a massive slowdown in the retirement of coal plants recently. There's still over 150 gigawatts of coal capacity online. Um, Only a third of coal plants have announced retirement in the US. So there's a big gap between um, what is happening currently and what needs to happen to meet climate targets. And that's kind of the lens we took at looking at this paper. Coal is also extremely complex. Tons of different technologies within the coal plant. You have different types of coal that you're burning, different types of combustion technologies. Um, the coal plants in the US as well are also located in extremely diverse regions in terms of their political context, their energy markets, their grid, as well as different cost structures. So through this lens, we're trying to figure out a way to allow policymakers a better tool set to actually help retire coal because strictly ranking across these factors kind of makes it very difficult for actual policy to happen when certain people disagree on the importance and order of which factors are most important in getting rid of coal plants. So through that lens, we developed a new method. The goal of this was to move beyond rankings and kind of allow a multifaceted analysis of coal plants where independent actors could come in and pick things that matter to them most and then get a set of tools to help retire the coal plants that fit that criteria. One of the big kind of assumptions and things that we're really pushing in this paper is that coal plants with similar characteristics are going to respond similarly to policy levers. So if you have a really large coal plant in an area that has a massive public sentiment against coal, very similar coal plants in different areas matching those characteristics will quite often respond in a similar way. So through that lens, we developed a graph algorithm to basically group coal plants by their high dimensional similarities. This meant going out and collecting a really large data set of over 62 features across all the coal plants in the US and grouping them so that we could apply specific targeted strategies to each group of coal plants based on their similarities. So we'll dive into the groupings a little bit more later, but here you can see our final graph that was used in the paper, where each group represents a unique subset of US coal plants that are characterized by different features. This is kind of touching on that a little bit more. Within each subset, we could make pretty detailed characteristics about the differences and similarities across the plants, causing them to group in this algorithm. The next thing we wanted to look at was that in the US, there are quite a few plants that have announced retirements. And the goal was how can we leverage the similarity of these plants that are retiring or that plan to retire to similar plants that have not announced plans to retirement. So this was where leveraging the graph structure of our results was super helpful, where we could actually measure and quantify the distance between retiring coal plants and non-retiring coal plants to kind of proxy the ease of retirement based on applying similar levers, as well as plants that are going to be very difficult to retire because they look different than these plants that are retiring currently. And through that lens, we were able to determine pretty targeted strategies for each set of coal plants in the data set. A targeted strategy was created by looking at the main drivers causing the plants that are retiring to retire within each group. And then based on these distances, extrapolating similarities across different groups of plants that would respond very similarly to these drivers. For the sake of time, I'm not going to pull this up right now, but later, if anyone has questions, we can jump into some interactive visualizations and look at exactly where each coal plant in the US fell in this graph. Awesome. And then wanted to touch on some key findings here. So after we created this graph and did a bunch of analysis, the goal was to make like generalizations about the coal fleet. One of the cool things that we came up with was that 33% of coal plants that currently have no plans to retire are highly vulnerable. By this, we mean that they are in very similar locations and or have very similar technical, economic, or social criteria to coal plants that are already retiring and will be extremely susceptible to the same exact drivers as those. For example, a coal plant that is currently being retired due to coal ash waste violations or increased compliance costs, you can take those vulnerabilities and map them to coal plants that look very similar, and yet those violations haven't been flagged yet. The next thing is that we found 8 different plant archetypes. This kind of came from our grouping of 8 different groups of coal plants. These coal plants were grouped across different technical, economic, and political characteristics to create that graph. And it became very easy to kind of label them and categorize them into very tangible subsets of the coal fleet. And the final main finding was that roughly 23% of the coal fleet is actually far from retirement. This means that these 23% of coal plants are not similar to plants that have planned retirements in any way. So we're going to need to come up with new and different strategies to help retire them faster. Wanted to do a quick run through of some of the groups that we put together. Here's the table of kind of all the groups and all their retirement archetypes. Again, a retirement archetype was derived from why the plants with planned retirements in each group were going to retire. Some of the biggest groups included Group 0, which were these fuel blend plants. These are coal plants which primarily are being converted and repurposed to burn natural gas. A a lot of the drivers for these conversions and causing retirement were regulatory pressures and clean energy targets. One of the other big groups here was this high health impact group. These plants have really high mercury, SO2, PM2.5 emissions, and we found that often these plants were closer to disadvantaged communities. All right, I'm gonna keep moving through here. Happy to go back to that slide later if anyone has questions on specific groups. And based on these groups, we were able to actually determine kind of what strategies we can use to close multiple coal plants in a group at a time, or to help organizations that are targeting specific coal plants kind of leverage this study and apply specific policy. So for groups 1 and 4, carbon pricing and securitization were going to be helpful strategies. Again, these are derived from the fact that the plants not retiring in groups 1 and 4 were extremely similar and close in this graph metric to plants that are currently being forced to retire due to these drivers. Groups 3 and 7 were public health and environmental justice advocacy. Groups 1, 5, and 6 were susceptible to renewable transition incentives. These plants were often in regions that had a high renewable penetration of their grid. And in general, these plants were just very non-cost competitive compared to renewables. Groups 0 and 2 are susceptible to regulatory compliance pressure. This includes things like coal waste ash violations, MATS violations, and in general, EPA violations, where regulatory compliance is either going to cause coal plants to pay for expensive retrofits or cause them to shut down for noncompliance. And finally, groups 2 and 6 were susceptible to community and work transition programs, where the majority of the reasons they were open and staying open was because there was a lack of alternatives in the community. All right, and I'm going to pass this on to Grace here if she can, if the Wi-Fi is working. If not, I'm happy to continue, Grace.
I think you should continue. Thank you, Sydney. Sorry about that.
No, no problem. All right, and wanted to touch on a couple key insights that came from kind of a detailed analysis of the graph structure of these coal plants. One of them was this kind of misaligned incentive in terms of stranded assets that we saw in a smaller group of plants within our group 3. This was that plants owned by IPPs, independent power producers, were actually incentivized to stay online even though they were in the negative in terms of their cash flows. Basically, these plants were stranded assets, but because they had high debt obligations, they would keep running at a loss and a loss to ratepayers as well, just because it made more economic sense to keep running than close and have to deal with those debt obligations. So this was an example of a group where coal debt securitization could really help speed up the retirement of these plants that are already just losing money. A second interesting insight was that politics can drive retirement independent of economics. Group 2 was our democratic plant group, meaning these plants were primarily located in democratic states. And interestingly enough, these plants were actually relatively profitable compared to the rest of the coal fleet, yet they were all retiring, kind of giving hope to the fact that independent of economics, retirements can be driven by politics if it's in the right scenario. Another interesting finding was that environmental justice inversion still happens. This is related to what I was talking about earlier in group 0, where you have plants that are not being retired in more demographically diverse communities and more disadvantaged communities. And you have plants that are currently being retired in less disadvantaged communities. Also, as I'm sure everyone knows, the Trump administration has been very pro-coal. So we wanted to touch on how kind of some of the policy that the Trump administration has been putting forward will change the resiliency and impact the groups and the retirement drivers of some of these findings. The first thing is that group 2, which was this Democratic plant group, is still really resilient. These plants had already paid for expensive emissions retrofit controls, typically because they were in democratic states that had stricter standards. So the Trump administration policies providing funding for retrofit controls and pushing back mercury air pollution standards don't really help these plants stay online. And additionally, they are in these democratic states that have strict policies in terms of renewable portfolio standards and net zero targets. So in general, our retirement drivers for Group 2 were extremely resilient to Trump administration policy changes and looking good. Group 3 was quite impacted. These plants had retirement drivers specifically around clean air violations, and health impacts. So Trump administration rollbacks of CCR, which is coal combustion residuals, and mass standards is definitely going to hurt one of the retirement drivers of this group. Additionally, reduced EPA enforcement makes it harder to retire plants that were in an archetype that EPA enforcement was driving their retirement. And finally, group 4, these are going to be mixed. The retirement drivers in this group were high forward costs and compliance related expenses. So in general, the rollback in regulations by the Trump administration is going to make these compliance related excuse me, these compliance related expenses much easier to deal with, meaning these plants will not be forced to spend on costly emissions control retrofits or revamp their coal ash facilities. That said, the plants in Group 4 were already highly uneconomic, and even without the additional costs of these retrofits, these plants were being outcompeted by renewables in general. So, although the Trump administration has been trying to save coal in this group, the uneconomic nature of the plants in Group 4 remains unimpacted. And that's going to be it for the most part. I wanted to point everyone towards a couple links here, and we can share this presentation after, but these are links to the actual 62 variables used in the study to group all these coal plants across a ton of different dimensions. As well as that, we provided a bunch of code and have recently made very big updates to it to increase the usability and the ease of analysis when trying to apply this to different data sets. So on the left here, we have links towards an actual reproducibility package for this study, as well as using our algorithm to try to apply it to your own information. And that's it. Thanks, everyone. Would love to turn it over and answer any questions.